course, the reason why we study these lives and celebrate these birthdays is because these disciples were giants in their own right, lights, if you will, lit from the one central light, which was Sri Ramakrishna. We begin with a small prayer. Om Stapakaya Chidharmasya Sarvadharma Swarupine Avatara Varishtaya Ramakrishnaya Te Namaha. O Sri Ramakrishna, establisher of religion universal, embodiment of all religions, to thee, noblest of divine incarnations, I offer my salutations. There's a reason why Gopalda, as he was called, why he was called Swami Advaitanananda. Advaita obviously is that section of the Vedanta philosophy which is the final culmination of realization called non-dualism. And so, how did he arrive at this understanding? It was because he was a married man and his wife died and he was overwhelmed with grief. And so he was persuaded to go and visit Sri Ramakrishna, the master, to assuage his grief. It didn't work first time round. And we can learn a lesson from that. If we have an expectation, what should a holy person look like? Holy Mother Sharada Devi said, don't expect that horns will grow on your head. Nothing extraordinary will happen. And so very often, holy people remain disguised. We can see even in the life of Holy Mother, when she visited Chennai or Madras as it was then, there were some expectations for somebody to speak, be a good speaker or something. No, Holy Mother doesn't give any lectures, but she lives a pure and simple life, and just being in her presence will be enough. And so, on subsequent visits, his grief was assuaged by one particular message that the Master told him about the unreality of the world. As soon as we understand about the impermanence, that's what we mean by unreality of the world, as soon as we recognize this impermanence, that the world, as soon as we see through the waves that we call the world, all our grief, all our fear, all the effects of doubt and temptations, they all go, and that happened with Gopalda, as we call him, the older Gopal, who in fact was a few years older than Sri Ramakrishna himself. He was the oldest of his monastic disciples. As soon as he felt that, naturally his grief went. And this, I think, is why when he took monastic vows formally, he was called Advaitanananda, he who has the bliss of complete unity or non-duality. There are not many reminiscences about Swami Advaitananda, Gopalda, but one thing, a few remarkable things stand out. One, the Holy Mother, who was a little bashful, she could only really communicate and open herself and be free with certain of the male disciples. Latu Maharaj was one of them. There was a young boy, but on the other end of the things, it was the older Gopalda. And so she was able to confide with him, and he used to attend to her needs. What a wonderful opportunity, of course, to enhance your spiritual life by serving what was viewed to be the mother of the entire universe. And one day, Gopalda had a great desire to present to the Master some ochre cloths and rosaries that normally would be distributed to monks or sadhus. And Ramakrishna commented, you won't find better monks than these young boys here. and please give the cloths and rosary to them. And we see really this was the start. This was the beginning of the whole Ramakrishna order. We can see the seeds sown there, so that it was very clear that the master wanted a monastic order of a slightly different type, because he wanted an order that was commensurate with his kind of truth, which amounted to Jiva Shiva, service to humanity. And Gopalda placed a bundle of saffron cloths before the master, and he then distributed them among the young disciples. That was a very significant thing. Again, another incident that stands out in the life of Swami Advaitanananda is at the Kashipu garden house when Ramakrishna was there, trying to recoup from the throat cancer brought on by incessant samadhi, spiritual ecstasy on the one hand, and incessant talking, service to humanity, giving out, making his ego an open channel for divine grace to flow to others. He couldn't stop revealing the truth day and night to others. Complete self-sacrifice and self-surrender. At this Kashipu garden house, Swami Vivekananda, then Naran, was sitting one day in meditation and lost outer consciousness. His mind flew beyond the realm of this relative consciousness, and he merged into the Absolute. Normally, if somebody does that, they can only survive in the body for some 21 days and odd. We have to remember that Sri Ramakrishna lived in that state for some 6 months. And so Gopalda, he became terrified. He rushed to the master and he reported, Narendra is dead. And of course the master understood that it was just the case of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, and he assured Gopalda accordingly. And of course, after some time, Narendra regained consciousness. This tells us something about the leader of the band of monks that became the world stage speaker, the voice of Ramakrishna to the world, this great Swami Vivekananda. We can now see the quality, the spiritual quality that this Swami Vivekananda himself had. But after the passing away of the master, Gopalda didn't have any home, nor did Tarak Maharaj, Swami Shivananda. They were the first occupants of the Brahmanagar Mutt, the first ramshackle monastery which was there. And then he stayed there for a few years, and then he went to Varanasi. And this is the most significant portion of his life for many, because there he practiced austerities, tapasya, and he stayed there for about 5 years. Somebody who had the privilege of staying with him at Varanasi says that his regularity in spiritual practices was wonderful. What do we mean by regularity in spiritual practices? Practice is not what we are concerned with. Steady practice is what we are concerned with. If you want to pass an examination, you can't say, I studied on Saturday, Friday, and Thursday whenever I felt like it, sometimes for half an hour, sometimes for a day, sometimes not at all. You have no chance of passing your examination like that. And it is the same in spiritual practice. That is why in every monastic movement, there are times of day for meditation, times for worship, times for work and pray, a combination of that, staggered throughout different times of the day, taking advantage of the mood of the day. And so spiritual practice is equivalent to constant remembrance of the divine as much as we possibly can, taking advantage of all our resources, taking advantage of time itself. And regularity is necessary. Just as regularity in eating is necessary, because at the time of eating, just at that time, gastric juice starts flowing in the stomach, saliva starts flowing in the mouth. So this regularity was a wonderful thing. So do we get a glimpse of the spiritual life in this example? Yes, very early in the morning, even in the severe wintry days. in Varanasi, he would get up and go to the Ganga for a bath. And from there he would return, shivering with cold, with inadequate clothing. But his mind was absorbed. How did he absorb his mind? He absorbed it in reciting some Sanskrit hymns. Whatever we do, whatever activity we're engaged in, we occupy the mind with an aesthetic thing, such as music, such as a creative way of looking at the world. Instantaneously we'll forget all our woes. Here in Bantry, I was talking a little earlier, or we were discussing a technique in meditation. When there is pain somewhere in the limbs, we can direct our attention to it and see all the various strands, all the varieties and colors of this pain. Sometimes it's elongated, sometimes it shifts. And it's a wonderful way of dealing with it and dismissing it also. So that we may have a distant sensation of pain, we're not really attached to it, a peculiar sensation. And so he would occupy his mind in this way. The program of the whole day was fixed, not haphazard, not according to moods. It was fixed, it was structured. And his whole life was to do with structure and simplicity, neatness, tidiness, a quality that the Master Ramakrishna admired greatly. And so he would follow it without the least deviation for days, for months, and for years. Now, a question arose when I mentioned this here. Somebody said, somebody who's practicing this, is it not selfish? Is he not trying to do something for his own personal spiritual advancement and nothing else? And the answer is that we have to train the mind. We have to train it with great perseverance and purity. And we have to be patient with it. But how is it benefiting anybody else? So I mentioned earlier that Jesus says you cannot hide your light under a bushel or bed. It's there to shine for everyone. And the fact that his spiritual practice was an inspiration and a wonder, as it's described, to any observer, is in itself an inspiration. And so, at that holy city, Varanasi, he simply lived on small quantities of cooked food that was collected from various households, as any sadhu traditionally would do. We do it because we don't want to tax any one household. That's why that custom is there. In that same way, we normally don't perpetually reside in one place. Adjacent to a place where an image of Shiva was installed, he occupied a small room, but even that room was neat and clean. And everything was kept in its proper place, a characteristic of perfection that served him and was an example to others throughout his life. His steadiness would cause wonder to those who watched him. And of course, he was quite indifferent to all the external sights and sounds around him and followed his own tenure of life in contemplation of the divinity from day to day without a break. This is why he's called Advaitanananda, because his dedication to that path of jnana is quite clear from this episode. Now, when Swami Vivekananda returned to India and organized the Ramakrishna Brotherhood, Swami Advaitananda, as he was now called, he became a monk. He returned to the mutt at Alambasa, that was then there. Afterwards, he stayed mainly at the monastery at Belur Mutt when that was established. And he looked after the management of various affairs of the monastery. That was his job. He did it extremely efficiently. But all the work he undertook or supervised had to be done very systematically, with scrupulous care, and he was very demanding in this respect. The young novitiates could hardly rise to his standard of perfection. And for this reason, they had a very hard time with him. In other words, they got good training. Many of them would receive mild rebukes from old Gopalda. But of course, to get rebukes from such a great, great personality, they took it as a blessing and also an indication of his dedication and diligence. But Gopaldas got a revelation from Sri Ramakrishna himself. In later life, he would say, "The Master has shown me that it is he who is manifested through all. Then whom to blame or whom to criticize?" And after this experience, Gopaldas ceased from finding fault with anyone, however great might be a person's errors or imperfections. And even in his old age, and he died at the old age of 81, which was a long age for those days, he was self-supporting and independent. He wouldn't like anybody to take trouble in attending to his personal needs. Being, of course, the oldest in age, he was looked upon with affection by his younger monastic brothers. Even Swami Vivekananda, composed a comical verse just to tease him. But you see, these kinds of episodes ever increased the affectionate bond between this monastic community. Some people who have observed brothers in the monastic community, will see this sense of concern, of love, affection, and of a kind of humorous banter between them, sharing the inner rapture of spiritual life, among other things. Old Gopaldas too had his moments of humor. In leveling out the premises at Belumwat, an area that was a kind of swampy and was used for the repair of boats, and so therefore very uneven ground. And his job was to level it out. But also he managed to plant things there, plant vegetables, flowers, etc. And it was Swami Nityananda who said to the young brahmacharis, "Look here, come and dig up this plot of land. I shall raise brinjals and potatoes here." They started digging up, but seeing this, Gopaldas saw that the ground was very, very hard. And it was almost a joke. So he said, "Oh, what a hard labor you have been given here. Come, go over there." And so that's what he did. Should these boys be made to work so hard? And so he told them quietly, "I tell you what, you brothers, dig up this plot for flower beds." Of course, the ground was much harder than the previous ground. And Swamiji and other monks had a hearty laugh at this when they heard him saying that. But in those days of hard work, you can imagine, it's not like Belur today with established gardens, lawns, even ground. People come in normal days and non-COVID days on weekends. They saturate the place for picnics and just to enjoy the beauty of the grounds, so well maintained. But in the beginning, it was hard. Malaria-infested ground, uneven ground. Just with any pioneering work, a lot of hard work was done, but it was done with a spirit of dedication, service to the Master. Gopaldas was not always successful with everybody, and you'll know by now that I didn't really fall into his camp in one regard. I fell into Swami Subodhananda's camp with regard to tea drinking. Anybody who knows me knows that I love tea, and so did Swami Subodhananda, Koka Maharaj. Gopaldas, on the other hand, felt that tea was going to give you dysentery. Swami Subodhananda was very adamant that it will increase your blood. Every molecule of tea will be so much enrichment of the blood. Anyway, Gopaldas' special duty was to look to the leveling, as I say, of the newly purchased land at Belur, which had previously been used for repair of boats and steamers, other things full of pits and canals. And of course, all this meant extremely strenuous work. But he willingly took the task on, producing vegetables even for the monks, flowers for the daily offerings. And he made strenuous efforts to mold his own life according to that of the master. And in this, he was a great critic of himself. He sometimes expressed disappointment that he fell short of this incomparable ideal that was Sri Ramakrishna. And this feeling of disappointment indicated really only his real spiritual heights. Because of his age, Gopalda, unlike the other monks, did not do any public works. He didn't do any talks or speeches, philanthropic work, missionary activities, or otherwise. So really his monastic life, from that point of view, was really uneventful. But that's also necessary. And the main thing really was the great example of his personal spiritual life, his outlook, that did not exclude hard work. It incorporated karma yoga as well as jnana yoga, both. His uniform steadfast not only in his spiritual practice was unwavering even in his last days of his life, and it elicited great, great admiration from anybody who witnessed it. And his love of truth also was wonderful. He heard the master say that one should not twist truth even as a joke or to make fun. And Gopalda obeyed this instruction to the letter. Not only the letter, but the whole spirit of it. And he insisted on others doing the same thing. Of course, he also managed to travel extensively on pilgrimage, visiting Dwaraka, Rameshwaram, and other places. And generally, he kept in sound health throughout his whole life. I'm not saying it was because he disapproved of tea drinking, but at a good old age, he lived and he suffered from, for some time, with stomach trouble, just that much. And so he passed away in a state of glory in Mahasamadhi on 28th December 1909, and he was 81. We really don't have any teachings of this great saint, but his life is worth contemplating. So let us just try and recap the steadiness of his spiritual life, the example that he set of truth, and even though he was steadfast in spiritual life and severe in his practice, he was still dedicated to hard work, to application of all the energies for a dedicated, concentrated cause, without complaint, and with a sense of humor also, a sense of brotherly love, and see how he tried to match up to this high ideal of the master who said, I have done all 16 annas. You may only do one or two. In other words, I have done the whole range of spiritual practice. I've climbed the entire mountain. I have not only read but written the whole book of life. If you manage to do a few pages, that's enough. And so I feel that in trying to live up to the great, great perfection of the Divine Master, he was striving for perfection, but still honestly acknowledging he could not exactly do all 16 annas. This is a remarkable life, therefore, of humility and sanctity. And as with all the apostles of Sri Ramakrishna, we can see the light of Sri Ramakrishna himself in this wonderful personality of Swami Advaitanananda. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. May all those lights that emanated from that one central light of Ramakrishna bless and transform us all, is my prayer. Thank you.